Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is.
There's a story most Americans have never been told about Abraham Lincoln. Not the Lincoln of marble monuments, not the Lincoln of history textbooks and holiday speeches, but the Lincoln who climbed into a courtroom buggy with his law partner one afternoon in Illinois and confessed a secret so dangerous, so career-ending, that he begged the man to take it to the grave. For over 150 years, that secret smoldered beneath the surface of Lincoln's legacy, kept alive only by fragments of courtroom records, controversial biographies, and the whispered debates of historians. Then, in 2015, a team of genetic genealogists did something that would have seemed like pure fantasy to those earlier researchers. They extracted the answer from human DNA itself. What they found settled one of the longest-running disputes in American historical scholarship. But it also uncovered something nobody expected. A genetic marker so rare, so geographically astonishing, that it quietly demolished one of the most cherished myths about who Americans are and where they really come from. This is not just a story about Abraham Lincoln. It is a story about a young woman prosecuted for the crime of giving birth. It is a story about how shame, stigma, and silence shaped the life of the most consequential president America ever produced. And it is a story about what happens when modern science shines a light into the darkest corners of the past. Let us begin at the beginning. Sometime around 1850, Abraham Lincoln was riding in a buggy with his law partner and close friend William Henry Herndon, heading toward Menard County, Illinois, for a court session. The two men had worked side by side for years. Lincoln trusted Herndon with more than legal matters. He trusted him with things he could not speak aloud in public. During that ride, Lincoln turned to Herndon and said something that would haunt American history for the next century and a half. According to Herndon's own account, Lincoln told him, "Billy, I'll tell you something, but keep it a secret while I live. My mother was a bastard, was the daughter of a nobleman, so-called of Virginia. My mother's mother was poor and credulous, and she was shamefully taken advantage of by the man. My mother inherited his qualities, and I hers. All that I am, or ever hope to be, I get from my mother. God bless her." Read those words carefully. Abraham Lincoln, the man who would preserve the Union, sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and deliver the Gettysburg Address, believed that his own mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, had been born illegitimate. He believed her father was an unknown Virginia gentleman, a plantation owner or wealthy farmer whose name was never recorded, and who apparently never acknowledged the child he left behind. He asked Herndon to say nothing while Lincoln lived. Herndon honored that request. Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. 24 years later, in 1889, Herndon finally put it in writing. He published a biography titled Herndon's Lincoln, The True Story of a Great Life, and in it he recounted that buggy-side conversation in full. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The Lincoln family was furious. Defenders of Lincoln's legacy called Herndon a liar, a man nursing old grudges, someone willing to invent scandal for the sake of a book sale. Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son, spent years fighting to control his father's image and deeply resented what Herndon had written. But Herndon had done something his critics could not easily dismiss. He had pointed to the historical record, and the historical record had receipts. Deep in the archives of Mercer County, Kentucky, researchers found a document dated November 24th, 1789. It was a grand jury presentment, the formal legal instrument of the era, charging a woman named Lucy Hanks with the crime of fornication. Now, to a modern reader, that word sounds archaic, almost quaint. But in late 18th century America, on the rough frontier edges of Kentucky and Virginia, a fornication charge against a woman meant one specific thing. She had given birth to a child outside of marriage. The existence of the baby was itself the evidence of the crime. The body of the infant was the prosecution's exhibit. This was not a metaphorical offense. Women convicted of fornication in that era faced real physical punishment. They could be publicly whipped, fined heavily, or confined to a house of correction, what we might today call a workhouse. Even if they escaped formal punishment, the social stigma followed them for the rest of their lives. Families were destroyed. Communities shunned women who had committed what the law treated as a moral catastrophe. Lucy Hanks had already given birth to Nancy Hanks, the future mother of Abraham Lincoln, around 1784, before that indictment. The timing of the 1789 charge likely corresponded to the birth of a second out-of-wedlock daughter, Sarah. 2 children. No husband on record. A grand jury had seen enough. But here is where the story takes a turn that tells you everything about how social survival worked in that era. On April 26, 1790, 5 months after the fornication indictment, Lucy Hanks wrote a short note in her own hand. It reads, "I do certify that I am of age and give my approbation freely for Henry Sparrow to get out license this or any other day, given under my hand this day, April 26, 1790. That note, still preserved in the historical record, was her consent to marry a man named Henry Sparrow. On April 30th, 1790, Henry Sparrow and Lucy Hanks were married. Less than a month later, on May 25th, 1790, the Mercer County Court discontinued the fornication case against Lucy Hanks. Marriage had restored her legal standing. The crime had been erased, not because it hadn't happened, but because a husband now stood between Lucy and the consequences of her past. What that document could not erase was the status of the children already born. Nancy Hanks, born around 1784, carried her mother's maiden name. Under the English common law that governed the American colonies and the early republic, illegitimate children took their mother's surname because their father had no legal existence in their lives. He was, as far as the law was concerned, a ghost. Nancy Hanks was nobody's legitimate child. In the blunt language of the legal doctrine of the time, she was filius nullius, nobody's child, a person with no legal claim to a father's name, property, or inheritance. Lincoln knew this. He had grown up knowing it. And as his political career rose from local Illinois courtrooms to the halls of Congress and eventually to the White House, he understood exactly what his enemies could do with it. In the brutal political arena of 19th century America, illegitimacy was not just a personal embarrassment. It was a weapon. If your opponents could prove that you were born from a tainted bloodline, that your family had broken the moral codes the society claimed to hold sacred, they would use it to question your character, your fitness for office, your very right to stand before the American people and ask for their votes. Lincoln had watched political figures destroyed by far less. He understood that the story of his mother's birth, an illegitimate child of an unknown father, whose own mother had faced criminal prosecution for bearing her, could be weaponized at any moment. He carried that knowledge through every campaign, every speech, every political battle of his career. And yet, in private, Lincoln did not speak of his mother's origins with shame. He spoke of them with reverence. That confession to Herndon was not a man unburdening himself of something filthy. It was a man acknowledging a truth about the woman he most admired in the world. He attributed his intelligence, his analytical mind, his relentless ambition not to the Lincolns, but to the Hanks line, to the blood of that unknown Virginia gentleman that had come down through his mother to him. All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her. He said it more than once across his lifetime. He meant it as the highest compliment he could pay any human being. The secret held. His political enemies never found it, or if they did, they never successfully deployed it. Lincoln became president. He held the Union together through 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. He delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of that same year. He won re-election in 1864. And he was murdered in April 1865, carrying the secret of his mother's birth with him to the grave at Ford's Theater. But the debate his secret had seeded did not die with him. For the 125 years between Herndon's 1889 publication and the 2015 DNA study, historians fought with genuine ferocity over whether Nancy Hanks Lincoln had been born legitimate or illegitimate. On one side stood the Herndon camp, those who believed Lincoln's own confession, who pointed to the 1789 fornication indictment, who saw the pattern of children bearing the Hanks name without a recorded father as unmistakable evidence of illegitimacy. Historian William Barton spent years building the case. eventually concluding that Herndon had been right all along. On the other side stood researchers like Lewis Warren, a Kentucky-based Lincoln scholar who published his opposing view in 1941 with characteristic bluntness. Warren claimed that Lucy Hanks was actually Lucy Shipley, a widow whose first husband, James Hanks, had died before Nancy was born, making Nancy a legitimate posthumous child. Warren wrote dismissively that any conclusion making Lincoln's mother illegitimate was but another of the Herndon myths. The problem was that neither side could prove anything conclusively. The frontier records of late 18th century Virginia and Kentucky were thin, incomplete, and riddled with ambiguity. Church records were sparse. Birth certificates, as a formal institution, barely existed in backcountry America. The paper trail was a web of gaps and guesses. To settle it definitively, researchers would have needed a tool that didn't exist in 1889 or 1924 or 1941. They would need to read the genetic code itself. In 2015, a team of genetic genealogists decided to do exactly that. The researchers, Suzanne Hallstrom, Nancy Reyes, Stephen Whitlock, Richard Heilman, and Gerald Heislam, had collectively spent decades researching the Hanks family. Some had devoted their entire professional careers to the mystery. One researcher had been working the problem since 1980, combing through documents at the Allen County Public Library, the University of Chicago, and the Library of Congress. Their tool was mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, a form of genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child through an unbroken female line. Unlike the DNA in a cell's nucleus, which mixes and recombines with each new generation, mtDNA does not shuffle itself. A woman alive today can carry the identical mtDNA sequence as a female ancestor who lived centuries ago. It is one of the most stable and reliable tools in the genealogist's arsenal. Abraham Lincoln himself has no living descendants. His last confirmed direct descendant, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, died in 1985 without children. The Lincoln line is biologically extinct. But mtDNA does not require Lincoln's own descendants. It requires the descendants of any woman in his maternal line, the sisters, daughters, and granddaughters of Lucy Hanks, who would carry the same unbroken maternal genetic signature. The researchers identified two groups of living descendants. Group A consisted of living female line, descendants traced through multiple daughters and granddaughters of Lucy Hanks and her confirmed siblings. Descendants through multiple daughters of Lucy's marriage to Henry Sparrow, including Margaret Sparrow Ingram and Lucinda Sparrow Richardson, as well as matrilineal descendants of Lucy's sisters Nancy Hanks Hall and Mary Hanks Friend. If the Herndon theory was correct, if Lucy Hanks was a true Hanks by birth, then all of these people should share identical mtDNA. Group B consisted of matrilineal descendants of the Shipley sisters, Naomi Shipley and Rachel Shipley, whom Lewis Warren had claimed were Lucy's actual sisters, which would mean Lucy was a Shipley, not a Hanks. The lab testing was conducted at Gene by Gene in Houston, Texas. Full mitochondrial sequencing was performed on all samples. The results were formally announced on October 21, 2015, a date chosen to mark the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. What those results showed ended the debate permanently. Every single participant in Group A, every living matrilineal descendant traced through the Hanks line, matched perfectly. Their mitochondrial DNA was identical, and that mtDNA belonged to a single genetic group, haplogroup X1c. Group B, the Shipley descendants, showed completely different mtDNA. Their haplogroup was H, one of the most common European lineages, entirely distinct from Group A. The two groups shared no common maternal ancestor, not in historical times, not in any traceable past. They were genetically unrelated on the maternal line. The conclusion was definitive. Lucy Hanks was not a Shipley. She was a Hanks by birth, the daughter of Joseph and Lee Hanks. Lewis Warren's theory was genetically impossible. Herndon's account was vindicated. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was exactly what Abraham Lincoln had quietly confessed to his law partner on that buggy ride in Illinois, the illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks and an unknown father. A 150-year historical controversy, settled in a laboratory. But when the researchers examined the specific haplogroup their samples had returned, they found something that stopped them completely. Something they had not been looking for. Something ancient. Haplogroup X1c. If you have spent any time studying genetic genealogy, that designation should give you pause. Because X1c is not what you expect to find when you are tracing a colonial American family from Virginia and Kentucky. Here is the context you need to understand why. All human beings can trace their maternal lineage back to a single female ancestor in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. As her female descendants spread across the globe over tens of thousands of years, random mutations in their mtDNA created distinct genetic signatures, called haplogroups, that act as timestamps, telling researchers when and where different human populations branched apart and migrated. Most people with colonial American ancestry of British, Irish, Scottish, or German origin carry haplogroups that reflect exactly those origins. Haplogroup H, J, T, U, K, or their various subcategories. Haplogroup H alone accounts for the greatest proportion of European mtDNA. If you randomly tested 100 people with colonial Virginia ancestry, the overwhelming majority would return one of those common Northern and Western European markers. Haplogroup X split into two branches roughly 20,000 years ago, around the time of the last ice age. Subgroup X2 spread widely into Europe, the Caucasus, and even into some Native American populations. But subgroup X1 took a completely different path. X1 is rarer and mostly limited to North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Near East. X1c is a specific subclade, a branch within that already rare branch. Haplogroup X is currently found at very low frequencies in Europe, less than 5% of all mtDNA. The X1 subclade is rarer still, concentrated in populations most colonial American families would have had no obvious connection to. In Eurasia, the greatest frequency and variety of haplogroup X is observed in the Druze, a minority population in Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as much in X1 16%, as in X2 11%. The Druze also have much diversity of X lineages. This pattern of heterogeneous parental origins is consistent with Druze oral tradition. The Galilee Druze represent a population isolate, so their combination of a high frequency and diversity of X signifies a phylogenetic refugium, providing a sample snapshot of the genetic landscape of the Near East prior to the modern age. DNA analysis of Druze villages in Israel suggests these ancient religious communities offer a genetic snapshot